Railway Conversations with Doc Frank.
Hey, I'm Doc Frank. Welcome to my podcast where every week I'm presenting you authentic, spontaneous and unrehearsed discussions with interesting guests from the rail industry about topics that matter. Make sure you subscribe and tell your friends about it, as this podcast will both educate and entertain them. Thank you for listening. Hi, it's Doc Frank here from the studio. Today's episode will be a real treat if you are a fan of advanced signaling and train control, specifically communications-based train control or CBTC. This podcast episode will be in two parts. Part one is the recap of a presentation about CBTC in New York with lessons learned for Australia and also other countries using CBTC that I gave at the core conference in Melbourne in June this year. This is a recap of this presentation where I had much more time to go really into detail without any time limitations. Part two of the podcast is a background story, what happened after that conference. And if you're interested in CBTC, which I guess you are if you listen to this episode, then I think the following information will be very useful for you as well. Please enjoy. Hi, it's Doc Frank here. Real quick, I want to let you know about one of the best CBTC trainings in the world, if not the very best, but you always need to be careful with superlatives. It's the CBTC Kickstarter online course. It consists of 30 video lessons. That's the 3 with the 0. In total, over 11 hours of training content, talking about everything from the basics of CBTC, current standards, the benefits of CBTC, the key functionality of it, the supply industry, application tips and tricks, lessons learned, do's and don'ts, case studies, arguably the most comprehensive training that you can find anywhere on the topic of CBTC. There are a few additional things that make learning easier for you that you may not find on any other online courses. One of them being an immersion plan that helps guiding you through the training course and progress it in a finite period of time instead of just having it sit there for months and months on end. There is access to an online study group where you can connect with other students who are doing that training course at the time and form learning groups. And after the training, you will not be on your own. There is an alumni community that allows you to ask questions about the course content on an ongoing basis. So it's basically education for life. You can register on my training portal, which is docfranktraining.podia.com/CBTC Kickstarter online 2023. I repeat that, docfranktraining.podia.com/CBTC Kickstarter online 2023. Let's dive into this presentation about New York's 25-year CBTC journey. I think what made this presentation particularly interesting for the audience was that I didn't just present what New York did with regards to CBTC, which is interesting enough in itself, but I also drew some lessons learned for CBTC projects that we have here in Australia. And obviously, if it's lessons learned for projects in Australia, then you can apply lessons learned pretty much anywhere in the world. So, if you will, it's quite a globally relevant presentation, this one is. So, let's start with a few impressions from the actual event. So this is me presenting, standing behind a lectern. You see a timer there. I mentioned the time pressure for the presentation. And that's one of the slides that you will see in a moment. I've got another picture here, which indicates that the room was actually quite full. I mean, you have the typical effect that there are a few empty seats towards the front. That's probably always the case, but you see that the seats in the back are pretty well occupied. And then there's another photo from the front, and you see that there are even people standing in the back. Now, there's one special thing about this third picture that you may pick up if you look carefully. There are a lot of the people in the audience smiling. And very often at those conferences, people are pretty serious, not to say stiff. And what happened during my presentation was that people smiled from time to time. There was the odd laughter as well. So maybe that was one of the reasons why this presentation was so well received. It was a serious topic. It was presented in a serious way. So I didn't play the clown behind the lectern, but it still got a few comical moments, shall we say, for the audience, and that loosened up the whole thing and made the reception a lot better. So let's get into the actual presentation. I started off by saying CBTC has its pros and cons, advantages and disadvantages. The biggest pro for CBTC arguably is that it's designed, it's conceived for maximum capacity. So the whole purpose of CBTC is to increase the capacity of a railway, or in the words of the oldest CBTC standard, it's there to maximize the utilization of rail infrastructure, which is nothing else than a bit more complicated way of saying we need to run more trains. The biggest con for CBTC arguably is that it's a proprietary product. That means all of the major global mainstream suppliers of CBTC, think of the Alstoms, the Siemens, the Thales, Bombardier, Hitachi Rail, they all have CBTC products, but they are all proprietary, which means that they can't really talk to each other. And as a consequence of those products being proprietary, is that mainstream CBTC, so all the CBTC products of these established global suppliers, are not interoperable, at least not by default. So it probably worth explaining what interoperable means in this context. And this is a slide from one of my training courses. You see in the top right-hand corner, the course is called High Capacity Signaling Blueprint. I just issued this recently as an online training in case you're interested. And here is explained what's meant by CBTC interoperability. So you have on the top of the slides two boxes, a green box with the wayside controller from supplier A and a blue box with the wayside controller from supplier B. Wayside controller in CBTC is the central control element on the wayside that's controlling all the trains in the control area. And then you see two trains as well, a yellow one which is fitted with CBTC onboard from supplier A, and a blue train which is fitted with CBTC onboard from supplier B. And you see the color of the arrows in between the wayside controllers and the trains. This color code will come back several times in this presentation and generally means green is pretty good because the green signal means that you have a free ride. Red is obviously not that good. So what's indicated here by those colored arrows is that the train with the onboard system from supplier A can talk quite well with the wayside subsystem from supplier A, from the same supplier, and the same applies to the train fitted by supplier B with the wayside subsystem from supplier B. That works quite well as well. But where the problem is are the red arrows in between. So a train fitted by supplier A will not be able to talk to a wayside system fitted by supplier B and vice versa. The problem is interoperability. You see this orange bubble in the middle. It's really across all those arrows. So in order to have an interoperable CBTC solution between those two suppliers A and B, all of those arrows would have to be green, which means that each train can talk to either wayside subsystem from either supplier A or B. So that much for the explanation what's meant by CBTC interoperability. In the next slide, I'm talking about supply strategies for CBTC. Now, this is something that I emphasize quite a bit in my training courses for CBTC, and I think it's very important to mention it here because most people, not even the experienced people, know what I'm talking about if I mention a supply strategy, but I hope it will be clear to you in a moment how relevant this is and how different the outcome for a railway can be depending on the supply strategy. So the first question you need to ask when you want to introduce and roll out CBTC on a railway network, on a city railway, is the question, will I have one supplier for my entire railway, for my entire network, or will I have multiple suppliers? So that's really the big differentiator here. It's one or more than one. If it's more than one, it doesn't matter so much whether it's 2 or 3 or 4. But the key differentiator is, do I have just one single supplier or do I have multiple? If I only have one supplier for a network, then the solution, the supply strategy is pretty straightforward. We will have a single supplier of CBTC for the entire network and for the entire train fleet. And then obviously there will be no problems with interoperability because everything comes from the same supplier and everything will work with everything else. If, however, I have multiple suppliers, I need to ask another question, which is mentioned here as question 2 or Q2. And the question then would be, the lines of my network, the different railway lines that form my railway network, are they separated or can they be separated? And the other side would be, are these lines of my network interconnected? And if they are, do they have to stay interconnected or can I separate them? And depending on the answer on those questions 2, the supply strategies will be very different. So if I can separate the lines, then I have the luxury to pick one supplier per line. And then an entire line with all the trains running on this line will be fitted by one supplier. Again, I will not have interoperability problems. And another line can be fitted by another supplier, but because I don't have cross traffic between those lines, there will be no issue with CBTC interoperability. So you see, this whole topic of supply strategies really revolves around the interoperability issue that CBTC has. Now, if the lines of the network are interconnected and I need multiple CBTC suppliers, for example, because my network is so big and the rollout will take so long that I cannot afford to put all my eggs in one basket and do the entire network with a single supplier. If that's the case and the lines of my network are interconnected and have to stay interconnected, then the supply strategy will require an interoperability solution. Now, this is the theory of CBTC supply strategies. Now, let's have a look at a few practical examples. So, New York City, and you see the acronym NYC in the bottom right-hand corner. New York City had a case where they needed multiple suppliers because it's quite a big network, New York Subway is, and the lines had to stay interconnected. So the way that New York works is you have many lines coming together, sharing a common trunk line and then diverging again. So, and because of that common trunk line, trains from all different lines will share a track in the middle, and therefore you cannot separate those lines because you wouldn't have enough tracks on those trunk sections of the network to separate the lines. And for that reason, New York City needed an interoperability solution, and we will see on the coming slides how this worked. The one supplier per line approach, the one in the middle, this is something that we can witness for Sydney Metro. and also for Singapore Metro, by the way. But since we are in Australia here, let's stick with Sydney for a moment. For Sydney, they have one CBTC supplier for the first CBTC line. They have just contracted a different second supplier for the second line of Sydney Metro. And the third line may have one of the existing two suppliers, or maybe they even introduce a third supplier. They could, if they wanted to, because the lines are separated and therefore there are no interoperability problems between those lines. Singapore has a more established network already with many more lines, but they have the same principle that all the lines are separated. There's one example where two lines are connected, but then you have the same CBTC supplier for both of those connected lines. So you always have one supplier per line or per subnetwork. And by doing that, you avoid any interoperability problems. There is an example here in Australia for the left supply strategy, the single supplier for the entire network. And that example is Perth. So the supply strategy in Perth for CBTC is to have a single supplier for the entire network. The reason why this works in Perth is that the network is relatively small and the rollout will be done pretty much in one go, line by line, in a very finite period of time, about 10 years. And the risk of having this done with a single supplier is relatively low, and the benefits to avoid any interoperability problems is quite high. And there are other metro networks elsewhere in Europe, for example, of similar size than the network in Perth, who have done this single supplier strategy quite successfully. Now, the presentation and the core conference was in Melbourne, so you may ask the question, where is Melbourne in this supply strategy scheme? And I show you. Melbourne is sitting there, and you can see from the color of this red arrow that this didn't quite work so well. So what Melbourne wanted to do in their 2012 network strategy was to separate lines that were previously interconnected. This didn't work out, and that's probably the main reason why Melbourne is currently moving away from a CBTC-based strategy for their network, and they're moving towards a more interoperable technology, which is ETCS, the European Train Control System. So let's start having a look what New York did. So you know now from the previous slide that New York needed an interoperable CBTC solution. How did they try to get there? So they picked the first line to fit with CBTC, and that was the Canarsie line. And they split the procurement of the Canarsie line into three phases. Phase one was a competitive ECI. ECI stands for Early Contractor Involvement. That's quite a normal practice these days for tendering of technology projects. And they ran a competitive ECI with three shortlisted bidders, with Alstom, Siemens, and Thales at the time. And this phase one was very successful. They planned to have it completed within 1 year, between July 1998 and July 1999. And they did complete that phase one on time. So that's why these figures are green and there's a tick behind it. Now, one of the previous presentations at CORE before I came on the stage was talking about optimism bias. And you can see here if phase one of a three-phase project worked so well on time, then there is certainly some optimism that the following phases will be as good and as fast. But as you can see, that wasn't the case at all in New York. So phase two was that one of those three suppliers from the competitive ECI was selected and contracted as the so-called lead supplier. In this case, for the Canarsie line, that was Siemens. And Siemens got the contract to fit the entire Canarsie line with their CBTC. But you already see that there was some problem there. The idea was to start the project in December 99, and it was started on time, so the start was good. But then it was meant to be completed in 5 years, until December 2004. And as you can see here, that didn't quite work. The actual completion date of the project was early 2011. So that means that the project was more than 6 years delayed. So instead of 5 years, it took 11 years to get it done, which obviously is not very good, and it indicates that there were a lot of problems in this project. But it's getting even worse when we look at phase 3, because the idea of phase 3 was that the lead supplier, which was Siemens, produces interface standards for interoperability. So in New York, they called it Interoperability Interface Standards, or short I2S. And then the idea was that the other two suppliers from the phase 1, Alstom and Thales, would be the so-called follower suppliers, and they would have to adapt their CBTC products to the I2S standards that Siemens had written up. And then also it was planned to demonstrate interoperability between all three suppliers on the Canarsie line with the same end date as the implementation by Siemens. So phase 3 had the same planned end date of December 2004. And if you look at the size of the delay for phase 2, you can probably imagine that phase 3 didn't go particularly well either. And in fact, it didn't happen at all. It completely failed. Phase 3 never happened. Phase 3 was never completed. So, does it mean that the interoperability approach in New York failed? I would say yes, but that doesn't mean that New York quit on the topic of CBTC interoperability, because they couldn't afford to. They had no other option. They needed to keep going with that interoperability idea. But the first attempt that you saw on this slide here failed. So they needed to get into a second attempt. And this is what the next slide is about. So the first thing they did is they issued a contract, a first project for a second supplier, which was Thales. And the first project for Thales was the Flushing line in New York. Now, what you need to know, which you can't see on the slides, is that there were only two suppliers left. Siemens, who kept building CBTC on the Canarsie line, and Thales, who got the contract for the Flushing line. The third supplier, Alstom, withdrew from New York altogether. Some of you may recall that in the early 2000s, Alstom as a company globally had commercial problems, and they needed to be bailed out by the French government at the time. So, and one of the conditions was that Alstom would withdraw from some of the non-core markets. So the withdrawal from New York was one of the effects. And the people here in Australia may recall that Alstom also pulled back from Australia for a period of 5 years in the early 2000s. That was the same effect as we had it here in New York. So there was only one second supplier left, Thales, and they got the contract for the Flushing line. Now, interestingly, this was kind of a Plan B attempt by the New York subway to have a separation strategy with two different CBTC suppliers for two different subnetworks. Because I did mention before that the New York network had lines which were interconnected. That's all correct. But the New York network for the subway is not just one network, it's two networks. It's divided into a so-called Division A network and a Division B network. And those two networks have different rail gauges, so there is no interoperability possible between those two networks anyway. Now guess what? The Canarsie line that was fitted by Siemens was part of Division A, and the Flushing line that Thales is fitting was part of Division B. So there was a possibility, if they couldn't get to an interoperability solution between their two suppliers, there would have been a possibility that the entire Division A would be fitted just by Siemens, and the entire Division B of the network would be fitted just by Thales. So you see the timelines at the end. The project was completed in time, in a period of 8.5 years, but you see that the schedule for this second project of 8.5 years was much more generous than the 5 years for the initial project on the Canarsie line. But it's still shorter than the total eventual project duration for the Canarsie line. So they're kind of learning, they're kind of going forward. What they also did in New York, they started another attempt of developing the I2S specifications, the interoperability interface specifications. But this time they didn't say Siemens should write it up and then Thales need to adapt their product. This time they had a collaborative approach where Siemens and Thales sat down together and jointly specified those I2S requirements. And this time they succeeded. What they also did was to pick a first line for interoperable CBTC based on these jointly developed I2S specifications. And the line for interoperable CBTC was the so-called Queens Boulevard line. The idea was to have that line fitted by both Siemens and Thales. So Siemens would fit a part of the line and a part of the train fleet running on that line, and Thales would fit another part of the line with wayside equipment and another part of the fleet running on this line. What happened then was, or maybe a stroke of luck, New York actually found a third supplier, Mitsubishi from Japan, which was willing to adapt their product to the interoperability specifications. So they qualified Mitsubishi as a third supplier, and later on they actually even gave a small contract to Mitsubishi to fit parts of the Queens Boulevard line to be able to demonstrate interoperability between all three suppliers, Siemens, Thales and Mitsubishi, on the Queens Boulevard line. And this project, Queens Boulevard line, even though it took a bit longer than expected, so there was a delay of about 2.5 years, but they got it done. They got it finished, and they did demonstrate interoperability between all three CBTC suppliers on that line. So to summarize what happened in New York, let's go with the theme or with the title of an old Western movie, because we are talking America here. So let's talk about the good, the bad and the ugly. What was good about New York? The good thing was that the CBTC applications on the Canarsie line and the Flushing line, they delivered the expected benefits. So the capacity went up, the safety was increased on those lines, the signaling safety. The systems were more available, so that means there were fewer system failures than before. And one big benefit that really blew the New York subway away was a much higher punctuality of train services. This is something that I refer to as operational reliability. So it was a real step change for them, and it was much, much better under CBTC than it ever was under the previous conventional signaling system. The second good aspect was that New York ended up with 3 pre-qualified suppliers that were interoperable between each other, so Siemens, Thales and Mitsubishi. And they put the foot down on fitment of the network with CBTC. So they started a so-called fast forward CBTC program, which consisted of 11 projects where CBTC was to be rolled out across the New York City subway network. What was bad about the approach in New York? One thing was that obviously it took much longer than planned. Originally, the demonstration of interoperability was meant to be shown in late 2004. It was actually achieved in late 2022. That's a delay of 18 years. The second thing that basically stuck out in New York in a very negative way, the first two CBTC projects in New York, the Canarsie Line and the Flushing Line projects, were the most expensive CBTC projects in global history. A few years ago, we did a price benchmarking for CBTC in Sydney, and the two New York projects were outliers, well, beyond reproach. Very, very, very expensive. And that has to do with the specifics of the New York solution. Let's go back for one step. The whole of life costs went up. And again, this has to do with the design in New York, because what New York wanted and needed for their migration process was an overlay of CBTC and the existing signaling system with rather old style relay interlockings. And yeah, they called it Auxiliary Wayside System, AWS. And that was a very complicated solution, and the whole of life cost, the maintenance cost went up simply because now you had two signaling systems to maintain, not just one. And another negative which was reported from New York was what they called untapped potential of getting the most out of CBTC. So I relate to this as a legacy culture. So they had issues in New York for the railway organization, for New York Subway, to make a cultural change to really adapt to the new possibilities that CBTC could give them. And then what was the ugly? The ugly one from a global perspective was that the New York solution, the interoperable solution in New York, was absolutely bespoke. So it was a New York only solution that would not be transferable to any other metro systems in the world. I did try. So when I did the CBTC planning for Perth, I spoke to both suppliers from New York, to Siemens and to Thales, about their about the possibility to transfer the interoperable CBTC solution from New York to Perth. And both suppliers said very clearly, no way, absolutely no way. And if suppliers have the opportunity to earn money and to slam the door against the competition and they decline to do that, that's normally a clear sign that you really shouldn't try and you should stop asking. So much about New York. So let's have a look at lessons learned, what we can take out of New York from an Australian perspective, or you can probably apply those lessons also to CBTC projects or CBTC initiatives in other parts of the world. I just focused on Australia, but I'm pretty sure that can be used elsewhere as well. As I showed you earlier on that slide with the decision tree with the supply strategy, New York City was in a different category regarding interoperability. So the interoperability in needs that we had in New York, we didn't really have in Sydney or in Perth, and Melbourne couldn't get there, so they have walked away from it as well. So the interoperability related lessons from New York are not transferable to any CBTC project in Australia. But there are other lessons that can be derived from what happened in New York. And I have summarized 7 of those on this slide here. Let's get into this. Lesson number 1. A client organization, a railway organization, need to take precautions against price hikes. So there's a risk when you go for a single supplier and you become dependent from this single supplier, that if you need to order more CBTC later because of a line extension or because you want to fit additional trains, then the prices may suddenly and unexpectedly go up. And when this happens, that normally means that the client organization didn't take the necessary precautions, for example, price escalation formulas or something like that. Now, before you say this is something that could not happen in Australia, let me tell you, it already has happened in Australia. And since we only have one CBTC line in operation in this country, it's not very hard to guess where it happened. And the pricing for the second part of the line, for the line extension, was significantly higher than the initial CBTC price for the first part of the line, and so much higher that it couldn't be explained with inflation. It couldn't be explained with foreign currency exchange fluctuations. It couldn't even be explained with COVID, because it happened before COVID. So the second lesson learned is be very cautious with legacy signaling interfaces. And the best way is to avoid them altogether. Now, for some railways, that may be easier said than done, but it definitely pays off if you really make the leap and you really replace everything old with a new CBTC system and try to get the maximum out of it. The more you have a mix between the new CBTC and an old legacy signaling system, the higher the risk is that the project gets too complicated, the interfaces can't be done or they will be delayed, it will be more costly than what you thought, and even the performance of CBTC could be compromised by the extent and the influx of the old signaling system components. Lesson learned number 3, you need to put up realistic delivery timelines. So that was visible in New York. If you look at the timelines for the second CBTC project for the Flushing line, it was delivered on time, but that was mainly based on the delivery timelines being more realistic than they were for the Canarsie line project. And if you are unsure how much time to plan on, then you better err on the high side. So rather plan a little bit more time with some buffers in there than not enough time, than too short of a delivery time window. Lesson number 4, suppliers need to be motivated with project pipelines. So in the case of New York, they now have pre-qualified 3 CBTC suppliers, Siemens, Thales, Mitsubishi. But now the trick is to keep this pool of 3 CBTC suppliers motivated. And the best way you can do that, I would almost say the only way you can do that, is to give those suppliers continuous pipelines of work. Work doesn't mean give them a broom and let them sweep the yard. It means give them projects, give them signaling projects, CBTC projects that they can continuously work on. Now, for how many of those 3 suppliers would you need such a pipeline? That depends on how many of those 3 suppliers you want to keep and how many you want to lose. Because you see it in brackets here, use it or lose it is the motto here. If a supplier runs out of project and you can't give them work for a foreseeable future, they will demobilize and they will walk away. They can't afford to sit around twiddling thumbs until you may give them some new work in 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, whenever. So a supplier that's not kept busy will disappear. And then you are not just losing the resources, you're also losing all the experience that those resources, those project teams have with your specific network, with your specific railway. And this loss is massive. So you really need to think about a procurement strategy that facilitates these pipelines, one separate pipeline for each of your suppliers that you want to keep on board. Lesson learned number 5, you need a robust and sustainable strategy. And as an example here, how it did not work so well, I've given you the line separation in Melbourne, which you saw earlier with that red arrow on the supply strategy slide. Melbourne had a good strategy. So the strategy of separating the lines and then having different CBTC suppliers on different lines, that would have worked if they could have separated the lines. But they ended up finding out that it's too hard, it's too expensive, they can't really do it. The biggest problem with separating lines is that for every line you need to have a separate train fleet, which means for every line you need to have a separate train depot, a separate train maintenance facility for all the maintenance that may happen on a train. And that was just something that Melbourne couldn't afford, and therefore, I think that's one of the main reasons why they ended up walking away from a CBTC-based strategy. Because they can't afford to have a single supplier for the entire network, and because the network is simply too big and the rollout will take too long, and they can't separate the network so that they can really have multiple suppliers for different subnetworks or for different lines. Lesson learned number 6, the implementation of CBTC needs to be ambitious. Now, what does this mean? It means that if you want to fit a line with CBTC, you should fit the entire line end-to-end with CBTC. And you should fit the entire train fleet operating on this line with CBTC, obviously CBTC from the same supplier. And again, sorry Melbourne, I need to come back and say this is something which was not done ideally in Melbourne, probably for good reasons, but the outcome is accordingly not so good. The entire train fleet operating on the first line fitted with CBTC was fitted with CBTC, the new high-capacity metro train. So that's a tick. That was done well. But the line itself was not fully fitted with CBTC. Only a very small part of the line will end up being fitted with CBTC. And that means you have conventional, the old signaling system, the old style of signaling on the largest part of the entire line on both ends, and only a little bit of CBTC in the middle, pretty much where the new metro tunnel is, plus the approaches on both sides. So this is not how you ideally should roll out CBTC. Another example here in Australia where it's done well is Sydney Metro. The entire line is fitted with CBTC end to end. Every train running on this line is fitted with CBTC, and every train runs from one end of the line to the other end and back. So that's a classic example of a well operating metro line fitted with CBTC. And then last but not least, number 7, the last lesson learned here for this presentation is the need for a culture change. And this requires a mindset shift, especially if it's not an entirely new railway line, especially if you come from an existing railway with a conventional signaling system, and now you want to migrate to a high capacity CBTC application. This will require a massive shift in mindset from what I call a legacy mindset towards a high capacity mindset. And this is a shift required not just for signaling specialists that have to deal with the new technology. The entire railway is affected by this change towards higher capacity and cap signaling. So people who never needed to know about signaling now will have to know something, at least the fundamentals of the new signaling technology, in order to support the transformation of the entire railway organization. So to summarize, coming back to the first slide where I said CBTC has pros and cons, to close the circle here, CBTC really has pros and cons. If it's applied appropriately, the benefits can be immense. And that was one of the takeaways from New York City. Once they had CBTC in, they were extremely happy with it. The benefits that they achieved compared to the old signaling systems were significant. The need for CBTC interoperability should be avoided, if at all possible. And we have two examples in Australia where it has been avoided, or it will be avoided. It has been avoided in Sydney for Sydney Metro. It will be avoided in Perth for the suburban network there. And if you keep having an interoperability requirement, for example, in Melbourne, this will likely lead to a failure and abandonment of the CBTC-based strategy. And then lastly, lessons learned are serious business. I hope that this last slide, the previous one with the 7 lessons learned, have really hit a nerve there. So lessons learned need to be kept in mind. They need to be implemented. They need to be considered all the way. And it's also important to listen to those people who know these lessons and who keep those lessons in mind and can remind other people of those lessons so that they won't be forgotten over time. Hi, here's Doc Frank again. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. And as I promised at the beginning, there is a second part to that about what happened after the conference. So the day after I presented in Melbourne at CORE in June, I was contacted by a consultant from Denmark by the name of David Chabanon. And he said he heard that I presented at a conference about CBTC in New York and he was interested in talking to me. So we did hook up. We had a Zoom call and talked about what he did. And he told me that he's been working in New York for many years as a consultant, even though he is based in Denmark, in Europe. And he's presently working in New York as well for a new strategy, a revamped strategy for CBTC in New York. Now, after I just did this presentation about the last 25 years of CBTC in New York, you can imagine how interested I was to find out more about this. And since I was organizing at the time the upcoming CBTC World Summit in September, I asked David whether he would be willing and whether it would be possible for him, whether he would get the permission from the Metro Authority in New York to present on this topic at a conference. So he got his permission. He did present at the CBTC World Summit, and the following clip is from the highlight reel of that conference and gives a little bit of a taste of David's presentation about the new strategy in New York.
David Chabanon from Denmark has worked on CBTC in New York City for many years and presented about the ambitions to accelerate the CBTC rollout and decouple CBTC from the secondary legacy signaling system.
So the current status is that the program is accelerating. So we have 5 lines in construction on top of the 2 lines already commissioned. We have 2 additional lines in the pipeline for procurement. We are progressing with the full CBTC conversion of all the rolling stock for the B division. So this is the division with the line letters, starting with letters. And we have the ATSB, which is the traffic management system that is delivered by Siemens, and which is in service already on the QBL and is being expanded to the rest of the B division. But as you can see, in 20 years, there have been only 2 line commissioned with the CBTC, 1 line recently commissioned on the QBLs. So this is not being done fast enough. So last year, the MTA has decided to accelerate this program and try to look at what actions could be implemented to accelerate the implementation of CBTC. And this is the purpose of my presentation, is to present to you what are the actions we have defined together that are already implemented, and what are the actions that are also planned to be implemented in the future to roll out CBTC faster. One of the challenges that we had in the past with the CBTC project is that what we call the AWA, so the auxiliary wayside system, really increased the complexity in the implementation, and is also a burden for the maintenance, because it's a lot of equipment, a lot of relays. On some projects, we have also implemented solid state interlocking, but the way to design, to test, and to validate is very complicated. So through a CBTC-centric approach, in fact, we are eliminating the concept of having a separate box called the AWS for the traditional interlocking control function. And instead, we are integrating this function into one system, into the CBTC system. After, it's up to the supplier how to implement it, either fully into the zone controller or some of the fixed block signaling principle into object controller. But the point is to eliminate this concept of having 2 different systems, CBTC as an overlay of an AWS system. So all the future CBTC projects will have the CBTC-centric specification, and we are currently updating the I2S to reflect that for Crosstown and for all future CBTC projects.
Hi, here's Doc Frank one more time before you head off. I hope you liked this podcast episode, the presentation about CBTC in New York, and also the little clip from the current developments in New York from David Chabanon. If you're interested in watching the entire presentation that David gave on that topic, the facelift for CBTC in New York, I've got good news for you. The entire conference, CBTC World Summit, has been recorded and is available for on-demand watching at any time from any place you like and how often as you like. It is arguably the most global CBTC conference that has ever happened in the history of the industry. There were 18 speakers from 13 different countries, and you can participate as if you were there live. You get to see all the 18 presentations. You get to see all the Q&A sessions after every presentation. And you even get to see the VIP fireside chats that, as the name implies, were only for VIP attendees of the conference. Now it's available for everyone, including for you. And if you're interested in this recording that is available for you for live, then please go to docfranktraining.podia.com/CBTC World Summit 2023. I repeat that, docfranktraining.podia.com/CBTC World Summit 2023. I hope you will participate in this conference, which may be your once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to participate in something like this without having to travel around the world and paying a fortune to do so. Hi, it's Doc Frank again. I hope you liked today's episode. I like to keep it as simple as possible, so I only have one single request for you. If you like this podcast, please tell your friends and colleagues about it. That's all I want, because that's a service that I'm providing to the industry, and I would like as many people as possible to listen to this podcast and learn something from it. So please share. And until next time, keep it simple and bye for now. Thank you for listening.